Using a grid helps me to go from this to this. I think you can see the picture on the left-hand side is a very basic grid with a very basic pencil drawing. The right-hand side is the completed piece. It's a piece of work that I did in charcoal and incorporated some color pencils. It's actually one of my earlier pieces in my charcoal journey. The question we asked right at the beginning about whether grids are cheating or not, I think we can just look back in history. Many famous artists, including Leonardo da Vinci and Albrecht Dürer, used grid methods to complete their drawings and get the base drawings down. The big difference with the way they use grids and the way we use grids currently, they would set up a frame. So as you can see in that little etching, the artist has set up a frame in front of the subject. The frame is a wooden frame on some kind of stand with strings across it, and then he replicates that same grid on his substrate, whether it's a canvas or paper. Obviously, this is still a method that you could use quite effectively if you're doing live drawing, but I think where it's really come into its own is with the advent of printers. So an artist can find an image that they like online, they can print it out, and then they can draw their grid directly onto that piece of paper, something that obviously they weren't able to do in the time of Leonardo and Dürer, and even MC Escher weren't able to use a desktop printer, not that we know of. We can use technology and go beyond actually just using a printer. And this method will help you to achieve whichever version you want to do, where we'll draw the grid on the image before we print it out, or you can draw the grid on the image and use the tool that you've drawn the grid on to move around, navigate the image, zoom in, zoom out, turn aspects of the grid on and off, which you can't do on a piece of paper. So you'd have to print out different versions if you wanted to have different grid elements on there. Please feel free to jump ahead by clicking on any of the chapters listed in the description below. Should you want to skip ahead and get a template pack for yourself, there are links to my Etsy store in the description below, where you can get my ISO art grid pack, which includes files for A4, A3, A2, and A1 art grids. Really easy to use, and includes an exclusive video tutorial on how to use the packs. Otherwise, enjoy the tutorial. So in this tutorial, I'm going to take you through my process of creating a grid template in Photoshop. This method should work in pretty much any tool, so if you don't want to use Photoshop and you want to use one of the free tools, the theory behind it should be very similar. So just some of my takes on using a grid. It personally gives me a much more accurate proportions. So it allows me to achieve the level of portraiture that I am achieving, because I'm quite quickly able to lay the loose drawing down onto a piece of paper and be quite accurate about it. So one of the big ones is it takes away that fear of a blank page. It's intimidating. You don't want to start drawing. There's too much that you can get wrong. What if you make a mistake when you put down your first stroke? Let me put this on silent. The next one, I think it also breaks that overall subject into smaller bite-sized pieces. It just helps you to have these almost building blocks to get to a decent version of your subdrawing. I think having a good workflow or system is helpful. I think it's something that I've certainly learned when it comes to graphic design and brand design. When you start building your workflow, it makes it much easier for you to start, do the work and finish with a strong result, so that you're not going back and doubting yourself, and you've got this process that you work through. And obviously, the more you work, the better you get at building that workflow, that system out. And I think finally what it's done for me is I get serious imposter syndrome when I start something. This has been a challenge for me, is when I start sitting down to draw a portrait, all of the things in my head start screaming out like, it's not going to look like the person at the end of the day, etc., which really gives me a lot of anxiety. But over time, as I've done this more and more, it's helped me to build confidence. And now when I sit down to do the grid, I'm trusting that process a lot more. I'm getting better at that process each time I do it. And the end result is just, as I get that subdrawing right, that end result actually is, I'm amazed sometimes by what I'm achieving, which is a great feeling. The anatomy of an A2 piece of paper is it's 420 millimeters wide if you're holding it up portrait, and 594 millimeters tall. My process is that I'm going to tape my piece of paper down to a piece of masonite. And in fact, I've got a couple of A2 pieces of masonite that have been cut to A2. So I need to be able to tape that down. So I need an area or border around my image or my working area where I'm going to be taping things down. That area also helps me when it comes to labeling my grid references. I put aside a 10 millimeter border all around the page, which I then use that area to apply the tape, and that then overlaps onto the piece of masonite. Mine, I actually wrap it around the edges, but if you're using a bigger piece of masonite, you'll be able to flatten that tape out. So what that leaves me with is a working space of 400 mils by 574 mils. And that makes it quite easy then to break up. My preference is to work with a 40 mil square. I'm going to drill into that because of the way we work, or the way I work my grid. You can create sub-elements in those grids that are going to help you if you need, and we'll have this ability to turn those on and off as we work through. Okay, so we've jumped over to Photoshop. I'm going to create a new document. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to give my document a name, and I'm going to call it A2 portrait. It's going to be 420 millimeters by 594 millimeters. That's the size of my A2 paper. You can change obviously the title, the width, height to suit whatever your default paper is you're using, and obviously the system can be inches, and you'd make it up for the size of the paper you want. I'm going to click create. So now I've got a new blank document, A2 portrait grid template. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put a rectangle on this, and I'm going to make sure that I use millimeters. So now if I think about a 10 millimeter border all around, I need to take 20 millimeters off of my page size. So I'm going to be 400 millimeters by 574 millimeters. Okay, I'm going to change my fill to be a sort of a middish grey. I don't need a stroke necessarily on this. It's got a yellow one. Let's just change that stroke for visibility purposes to 1 to black. Okay. So there is my drawing area. So I'm going to rename that drawing area. Now, a lot of people will ask, why am I not using the grid feature, which is more for layout in Photoshop? I want a grid that I can alter aspects of quite easily, each of the chunks of it, and I also want a grid that I can print, because there's two ways of using this. Is you can bring in your source image, you can lay it out in this, create your grid, overlay your grid, and then print it out so that you can use it the traditional way where you've got a printed image with a grid on it. Or the way I use it is I actually have my PC open while I'm working, and I can zoom in and out and pan around and really interact with the image and the grid, etc., while I am working on my easel next to me on my desk. So the next step is I'm going to start creating my building blocks for the squares on my grid. So I'm going to click over to create a new square, and this time I'm going to put the width at 40 millimeters by 40 millimeters. It's very important that if this comes up like mine, and it's prompting me to put in a pixel size, that you put in the mm both on the width and the height. Otherwise, it'll only change it to that particular measurement system on the cell that you select. So you could end up with something that's 40 pixels wide and 40 millimeters tall, for example, but we've done it correctly here. Okay. What I'm also going to do is I'm going to change my stroke to 0.5 millimeters. Okay, it's just going to be a little bit more visible, and it's also going to have a no fill. Okay, so we need a stroke and no fill so that we'll be able to see through that block when we've got the source image below it in the layers. Let me just zoom in up here, and then I'm going to take this rectangle, I'm going to rename that as grid element. I'm going to select it and drag it and snap into my top left corner there. Okay, please make sure you've got the snapping to layers turned on, and the way you do that is you come up to view, you go to snap to, and you just make sure that layers, snap to layers is turned on. Okay, so we've got our first basic element in place. What I'm going to do is I'm going to convert that into a smart object. And the reason I use a smart object, there's several reasons. So the first thing is if I double click on that smart object, it opens up that smart object as a separate file almost. And this is where I'm going to set up my sort of building blocks for my grid elements. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add another rectangle. This one I'm going to halve the size. So I'm going to be 20 millimeters wide by 20 millimeters tall. And this is my sub-grid element. And what I can do here is I can play around and even change the stroke to 0.25 of a millimeter. Again, remember to put in millimeters. I could even change the color of that stroke. So for example, let's just use red for now. Okay. I'm going to rename this to 20 millimeter sub 1, and then I'm going to duplicate that, and I'm going to snap it over here. Okay, so it's very important at this stage where you make sure your snapping is aligned up quite nicely. So you can see those are vertically and horizontally they're aligned. So I'm going to group these, and I'm going to call these 20 millimeter sub grid. Okay, I'm going to switch that off for now, and then I'm going to draw a single line from that top pixel across to there. It's snapping 45, it should be 45 degrees. There we go. Let that go. I'm going to change this to be let's use a green, bright green for now. And I'm going to leave it at 0.25, and I'm going to duplicate that. Horizontally. So now I've got two diagonal lines. Okay. I'm going to group those, and I'm going to call those diagonal subgrid. I'm going to switch, sorry, that's supposed to be in that group. So I've got my two horizontal lines in this subgroup, and I'm going to switch on that group. You can pick which one. I'm going to prefer to see the quarter grid. Now if I come up here and I close, I must save, if otherwise it's not going to save any of these changes that I've made, but we're not saving it as a separate document. It's basically saving it back into our template file. If I click off of that, you can see we've got this little grid element. Okay, so I'm going to duplicate that grid element, and I'm going to call this one grid element master, and I'm going to be duplicating this one. I'm going to leave it where it is, and I'm going to explain this shortly. Duplicate this one, and I'm going to call it grid element 2. I'm going to drag that across, and I'm going to make sure it lines up properly. Just make sure I zoom in. You can see it's made that line thick, so it's not lined up over the edge. We almost want to make sure that those lines have the same thickness. Okay, and I'm going to do that again. This one I'm going to call 3. And I'm going to drag that across, make sure I'm positioned correctly, just nudging it into space. And repeat again, and I'm going to do this until I've got 10 columns. So I'm not going to force you to watch me do that 9 times. Okay, so I really made a bit of a hash of the names, but I've fixed that up. So I am going to leave the grid master. I'm not going to select that, but I'm going to select those 10 grid elements. I'm going to select them all, and then I'm going to say new group from layers, and I'm going to call this one row 1. Okay, now I'm going to duplicate that. Let's get the names right this time, and I'm going to call this row 2. And let me zoom in again just to be super accurate on the grid. It's really worth getting this right, but you're going to use this document every time you want to create an A2 grid. So I'm going to pull it down, the duplicate, and then I'm just going to nudge it into place so that those outlines overlap perfectly. I'm going to scroll down, and I'm going to duplicate row 2 and call it row 3, and I'm going to do this so that until I've got 14 rows of grid elements. So now we have a full grid. We do have a little bit of a space at the bottom here. I'm not going to worry about that. Typically what I do when I'm doing a drawing, I pick where I want that to be in my drawing, and I just add that in. You can leave it out completely and not draw that particular part of the source, but it's fairly easy to translate that last piece if you want to continue using it. But that's the grid. So what I'm going to do, I'm again selecting all of these rows, and I'm going to put those into a group. I'm going to call that grid. Okay. Now I still have this element here, and basically it's not visible, but what I can do is I can click on this, and there's my grid element. So I can turn off, for example, if I don't want the quarter grid, turn that off, save that, and what will happen is you can see that now every single one of those blocks, because they're a clone of that grid element master, they've all updated. And the same is true as if I wanted to go in there and I wanted the quarter grid on, I didn't want the diagonal grid element. I can switch around, save that. But you can see now I've got the quarter grid, not the diagonal grid on. So it gives you a great deal of flexibility. We also change the color, and we'll see that in a bit. Okay, so what we need to do now is add labels. Pretty straightforward process. Let's start at the top. I'm going to zoom in up here. I'm going to use my text tool, and I'm going to add a text element, and I'm going to put in A space B space C D E F G H I and J, just a space between all of those. I'm also then going to just roughly align that up with that center of that quarter grid. I'm going to zoom out a touch. Okay, select my text, select all of that, and I'm just going to play around with this until it looks like I've aligned each of the labels up with each of the columns. Okay, just nudge that around, and you should, if we look at on this side, so J's just a little bit short, but that's fine. I think the rest look good. So now we have horizontal layers. We're going to do something similar. I'm going to come over here, and I'm going to get lined up here, and I'm going to put 1, and I'm going to hit enter or return 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. Don't worry about these. Select all again. I'm just going to line this up properly so our numbers don't look a bit weird. Okay. And I'm going to play around with this one, and like just similar to what we did for the horizontal, I'm going to dial those until they're sort of lined up with each of the rows. I also will change the the alignment to right, justified. Just nudge those across so the numbers are lined up. Let's zoom out. So now I've got my horizontal letters. I'm going to rename that horizontal letters top. And I'm going to rename this to vertical numbers left hand side. I'm going to duplicate this layer, and this one's going to be horizontal letters middle, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag that down to sort of that line there, which is around my middle. Duplicate that one again and call that bottom. The middle one's optional. You don't necessarily need to have that. I just find it helpful when I'm zoomed in that if I want, I can see where I am. I'm just going to make sure I put this outside in my margin or my border. So there's my horizontal letters. So I'm going to just group those. New group, horizontal labels. And take my vertical left hand side, duplicate that. I'm going to call this center. Drag that across more or less to the center. I'm holding down Shift to constrain it. Let's center it there, and then what I can do is I can select that whole piece of text and center align it, and then just nudge that back over to there roughly. And then I'm going to duplicate that layer again. Again, this layer, it's optional. The center and the middle are optional. Holding down Shift, move it across to here, select it all and left align it, and just nudge it over. And take all of those verticals, put those into a new group called vertical labels, and then take those two label groups and put them into another group called labels. So we've got our grid, we've got our labels, we've got a drawing area, and we've got a grid element master, which I've explained how that works. What we can do now is turn this drawing area into a smart object and duplicate it. Drag that up to here and switch off the view of it. Okay. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to color these two areas as seafoam and these areas as, I'm going to make those red. Okay. So the green is the areas I want to edit, and we can toggle labels and we can toggle grid on and off. Okay, so the drawing area, we're going to call this place source artwork here. And I'm going to go into that because it's a smart object. It's opening as it's actually got that rectangle in it that we dropped in earlier. What I can do now is find a source image. and I'm going to bring in this picture of Trent Reznor. Okay, so that's open in another document. I'm going to duplicate this layer, and I'm going to set the target of the duplicate into that drawing area. Click OK. I can close this now, and there's my picture of Trent Reznor. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to position him, try and compose him into where I think he would look good in a portrait, because I like a lot of detail in my portraiture. The face, I'm going to really focus on the face, so losing some of the rest of the image. But if I accept that change, you'll notice that the image is still there. Okay. I'm going to close out of this, make sure I save, and then if I come back to the grid, there is my source image in my grid. It's got the grid lines on it, it's got the labels on it. The beauty of this grid now is that I've got this master element that I can come into, click on the smart object, so make sure you click in that rectangle, and I can change my lines. So if I come here, I can set those to a different color. So if I wanted it to be yellow, for example, I can do that. And also what I can do is switch on my diagonal, close out of here, and now you'll see the grid. The only grid that I'm going to draw up is the black line on my artwork. In fact, let's go in and change that grid element. Let's change that to a red as well. Save. And there you go. You've got your grid. Grid element is a smart object, so you can change that up, change up your visibility, switch elements on and off, and you should be good to draw up your grid. The one thing that I also wanted to show you is if I go to this smart object and I'm going to put a adjustment layer, black and white, over the photograph. So you'll see there's an adjustment layer in my layer panel. I can switch that on and off and I'll get the color image. And also I can dial this in if I want to a little bit more, but this is quite a good result. Some nice contrasts there for me to play around with my charcoal. Go out of here, save, and that will update my grid template. Now typically when I'm going to draw this up, just to start my drawing, I'm probably going to go into my grid master, turn off both the diagonal and the quarter grid, save that, and there I've got a straightforward grid, which makes it easier just to get all the shapes and that in across. And then when I go into areas where there's a lot more detail, I might then come back in when I'm doing these areas and turn on my diagonal grid or my quarter grid just to dial in all of these little structures. Okay, before we close out here, I'm going to save it back as a template. So I want to go to my grid element and I want to switch the quarter grid and the horizontal, the diagonal lines back on, save that. I want to go back to my place artwork here item. I'm going to remove those two layers I added. I'm going to add some text in here. Place source here. Grab that piece of text, bring it down into the center. I'm going to also add a rectangle with a white stroke, 1 millimeter, no fill, just around there. make it look a little bit pretty. And I am going to group all of this and call that delete me. Okay, let's close that, save it, and we zoom out. We have a template. The last thing we need to do is save all of this, and I'm going to click File Save As. I'm going to save it on my computer. I'm going to drop it into that same folder, but what I'm going to do is when I save it, I'm going to put a T at the end of this, PSDT. So what that is it becomes a template. So if I close this and I go open and I go to this folder, here's my template. If I double click that, it's going to come in as an untitled document. So it's not going to open it as the template. So if I make changes here by mistake and save this, it's not going to overwrite my template. So every time you open a template document, it starts a new document, but with those components in it. And we can come in and bring in, like we did during the source, come in here, open our source image, duplicate that into my drawing area, close the source, resize however I want it, really compose it the way I want it. And typically it'll take a little bit more time. I can delete this and save this, and now I've got a project file that I can start working on. I hope you found this tutorial useful and that now you can go and create your own grid to whatever paper size you want to use. If you don't want to go through that whole process of creating your own grid, I do sell a grid pack on my Etsy store. It's set up with a number of different paper orientations and paper sizes, and there's a link in the description below. Also, if you're looking for any of the prints of my artwork, you can reach out to me. I do sell prints. Please hit like and subscribe if you're finding my channel useful. Otherwise, I look forward to seeing you again soon.